Number one, work to imitate God's faithfulness. Is God's faithful when I make a plan? It's yes because I plan to do it. It's not yes and no. It's not vacillation. It's not going back and forth. Work to imitate God's faithfulness. Now, if you're going to work to imitate God's faithfulness, which I think is not just your assignment for this week, it's the assignment for the entirety of your Christian life. As you endure and persevere to the end, you should be saying, I want to be faithful because God is faithful. I want to imitate that communicable attribute of God. And that should be your endeavor. And if you're going to do that, you better look in the Bible and try and find reminders of how faithful God is. I could go to the propositional statements that just indicatively say God is faithful. We could look at a lot of those, and I could prove that to you, but I think you're past all that, and you know that. You know God reveals himself as faithful, but I want to show you there's something that we're always continually in touch with that speaks to this as well. Now, let me quote a passage for you that you're familiar with, I assume. If not, you might want to turn there. Romans chapter 1. As he begins this discussion of the first theme in Romans in earnest, you can take a look at what he says here in Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, talking about the coming wrath of God. And he says, you know, that wrath of God is coming against people who suppress the truth and unrighteousness, and you're going to throw a flag on the play, as many people do when I share the gospel with them, and they say, well, there's a lot of people that don't know the truth of God, so how can they be held responsible for not keeping the truth of God? And he's going to respond to that. Anticipating that objection, he says this, verse 19, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Those are some great statements. God has shown them what he expects of them. It's plain to them who God is. If the whole crescendo of this section is, y'all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, right? He's going to, well, how would I know what the glory of God is? It's shown to them. How's it shown to them? Verse 20. For his invisible attributes, and here's something that's invisible, God is faithful. Yeah, it's invisible in the sense that I can't see, the label on God's coat that says he's faithful. I can't see that. But I know that God is faithful. He's revealed himself to be faithful. Now I'm going to have to look to things that he's done. Promise and fulfillment. That's one way I look at his faithfulness, but he doesn't go there. He's saying, I know the objection is, what about people that don't know the truth? Well, they do know. They know the basic truths. They know his invisible attributes. Namely, he starts with this one because this is basically saying there is a God. Eternal power. Right? Even just sitting back and thinking of the philosophers that preceded the New Testament era, they're thinking about the ultimate cause of the universe. And all you have to do is live outdoors more than we do to start to respect the power of creation reflecting the power of God. And he says those invisible attributes. Let's start with his eternal power and his divine nature. That means his perfect, divine God nature, which under that rubric, under that umbrella, you could put a lot of different things that we would list as the attributes of God. They have been clearly perceived. God's not holding anything back from us. Ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that your little imaginary guy that's living out in the jungle, they're without excuse. Especially if they're out in the jungle. They certainly know this. God is powerful, and then they can start to chronicle within nature, as is laid out in passages like Psalm 19, a lot of the attributes of God are on display. Okay, you all know that, right? Nobody gasped, no one passed out. You know that truth. Go to Jeremiah 5 with me. Our topic today is God's faithfulness. Just want to think about that. God's faithfulness. It is on display. And his power. That, I guess, is at the top of the list. I mean, all you got to do is see a volcano explode. All you got to do is be in the middle of an 8.0 earthquake. Right? You just have to see a typhoon or a hurricane. You'll start to say, wow, this God who controls the universe must be pretty powerful. Jeremiah 5, start in verse 22. Let's read a few verses here. Do you not fear me, declares Yahweh, declares the Lord? Do you not tremble before me? Well, if you're caught out on a ship on the sea, on the Mediterranean or the Pacific, and there's a big storm, well, then, you know what? You'd start to cry out to God, as often happens. Just ask the sailors who toted Jonah around. You're going to say, wow, I need to tremble before the Lord. Now he's going to say something here. I place the sand as a boundary for the sea and a perpetual barrier that it cannot pass. Though the waves toss, they can't prevail. Though they roar, they cannot pass over it. Now, Al Gore's musings notwithstanding, okay? The shoreline's a pretty reliable thing. You can build a highway there. You can buy some property there. I mean, things might burn down, and maybe if you build it up on a plateau that's overlooking a cliff that's overlooking the ocean, you might have some problems there with some erosion. But here's the pretty clear thing. We can make maps, we can build roads, and we know where the shoreline is. There's a lot of water and a lot of power, and there's a lot of storms, a lot of waves, a lot of tumult out there. But, here's the thing. God's pretty faithful about saying, here's the ocean, here's the land. We can see that. Verse 23, but this people, talk about transgression. Well, the ocean doesn't transgress the shore. It beats up against it, but it knows its place. This stubborn people, this rebellious-hearted people, they've turned aside and they've gone away. They do not say, verse 24, in their hearts, let us fear the Lord our God, who, by the way, let's speak of his faithfulness again, who gives rain in its season, and autumn rain and the spring rain, and keeps for us the weeks appointed for the harvest. This was written in the 6th century before Christ. 600 years, roughly, before Christ. This was written 2,600 years ago, and yet farmers today in Central California on the same schedule that they were on in the farmers of the day here in Judah. Same schedule. God is faithful. Right? They may not have understood all that you think you understand about the creation of the world, like this huge satellite that floats around and creates the tides and gives us all kinds of things that relate to some of the weather patterns on this earth. They might not understand meteorology the way that people do today, but they certainly knew this, right? We're a year from where we used to be, and it must be harvest time again. And things continue on. You want to try to measure something about the microscopic entropy in time? Well, okay, you can try and do all that, but the bottom line is things have been going on with spring rains and autumn rains and time for harvest as they have been from the beginning. So we know, here's something about God that we know. He is a faithful God. Phases of the moon are faithful. The sunrise is faithful. The harvest time is faithful. The boundaries of where the sea stops and the land starts, faithful. Now, the whole crescendo of the problem in Romans, by chapter 3, is that we've all sinned. We fall short of the glory of God. Here's one thing I want you to think about. How faithful is God? Just in the natural theology, the declaration of God's faithfulness, and then how faithful are you? And all I'm telling you is the delta between those two, the gap between your faithfulness and God's faithfulness, well, I can't even do anything straight for 26 minutes, let alone 2,600 years. I need to learn to be faithful. I need to be in humble respect of God's faithfulness. I need to study his faithfulness, and I might even quote this, Genesis chapter 32. When Isaac was there, and he was thinking about the third generation of God's faithfulness to the covenant that God made with Abraham. No, it wasn't Jacob. It was Jacob, not Isaac. Jacob looks back at Abraham, his grandfather, and says, look how God was faithful to him. Then, hey, let's look at his son, Isaac, and how he was faithful. And now he says, look at how he's faithful to me. Let me just quote that passage to you. Genesis 32, verse 10. He says, I'm not worthy of the least of all of these deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness you've shown your servant. That picture of humble recognition of God's faithfulness, I hope you recognize that. How many times have you gone through the cycle of whatever it might be, even waking up every morning, shoving breakfast in your mouth and going off to work, getting your paycheck twice a month or how often it comes, and how God has provided for you, and just all the things that go beyond all the artificial means of provision, but all the geographic and the cosmological and the meteorological provision of your life. It happens all the time. God is faithful. And even if you think on the spiritual side of things, you think about Jacob saying, look at my grandfather and my father and now me. And then he's thinking of his kids in this passage. My kids, God is faithful. I want you to study the faithfulness of God. And wherever it pops out in your reading of the Bible, your study of the Bible, I want you to say, wow, I'm a recipient of the faithfulness. I can depend on God, not just in his soteriological promises in prophecy, but I can even look at the world that he's made and I can see something about how I fall short and I need to stretch. Here's a good word for our sanctification. I need to work. I need to work hard to imitate the faithfulness of God. And I'd like to be faithful. When I say something, I want to be able to be people to count on me. Like I can say, I'll meet you tomorrow morning when the sun rises. I want to be as faithful as God. Now, I can't humanly be as faithful as God. Humanly speaking, I can't be, but I'm going to strive to be as faithful as I can. Now, again, the exception here is that Paul isn't being faithful to his word, and he's about to explain why. His intentions were good, his motives were good, and he had good reason for not being faithful to that. But he says, that's my intent. As God is faithful, when I say something, I'm faithfully planning to do it. And if you're a young person in this room, I just got to stop and say, and I mean it, junior high, high school, college, if you would just be faithful in your generation to be where you say you're going to be at the time you say you're going to be there, that you're going to finish things you say you're going to start, whether it's a program at school or a team that you've joined or some season in soccer. I don't care what it is. I guarantee you'll be stand out in your generation because we're living in very unfaithful times. The next generation needs to learn to be faithful. Can I trust you when you say you're going to do something? Or do I think, like the critics of Paul thought, is it true of you that when you say yes, I got to say, well, we'll see. Well, I don't know. Maybe it's yes in his mouth, but no in his heart. I don't know. Now let's start vertically because that's the most important kind of faithfulness you need to reflect. God's been faithful to you. He's faithful in this world. You should be faithful to him. And maybe I'll quote the last chapter of Joshua as Joshua ends his ministry, and you know this. Let me read it for you. At the end of Joshua, he says in chapter 24, verse 14, he says, guys, I need you now that we've settled in Canaan. I want you to fear the Lord. That's where it starts. The power of God. You ought to be recognizing humbly that you're small and he's big, that he's powerful and you're not. You didn't choose when to be born, and God can snuff your life out today if he wanted to. I humbly serve him in fear. Serve him in fear and in sincerity. That's what Paul's trying to highlight here. And here's the next thing. And in faithfulness. Be faithful. And that means you got to put away the gods of your fathers that they worship beyond the river and in Egypt. Stop. You need to serve the Lord. How? With sincerity and faithfulness. You fear him. I'm subjected to him. He's in charge. And therefore, I want to be faithful to him. And whatever the Lord says, I want to do that. And when we commit to do it, vertically, we ought to do it. You know, God calls you to do some things. He says you should not forsake the assembling of yourselves together, as is the habit of some. You shouldn't do that. That's codified in the Word of God. If he says you should be faithful in coming to church, you should be faithful in coming to church. If he says you're a good steward of what I've invested in you, ought to put that to work to serve the body of Christ. 1 Corinthians 12, 1 Peter chapter 5, then you should be faithful. You should have a ministry post. You should be faithfully serving every week. If he says you have support financially where you're being fed spiritually, well, then you should do it. It doesn't matter. You got to be faithful. You got to do it. You can serve the gods of your fathers, right? If it was the gods across the river and in Egypt, they just do whatever they want to do. They plan and they serve according to other gods, and other gods are fashioned to be able to meet my appetites, right? Where it's a projection of what I want. You can serve yourself, which is really what it is, to serve another God, or you can serve the real God and do what he says. If he says you need to be praying always, pray every day, pray without ceasing. As a habitual, like a hacking cough, you ought to be coughing up thoughts to God. If he says that, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, then you should be faithful to do what he says. If he tells you to share the gospel, that you're an ambassador, you ought to speak up for him. You ought to be his representative in this world. Then you better speak up to non-Christians about the fact that you're a Christian. You ought to represent him in this world. Are you following this? Everything vertically. You ought to think about, God, I want to be as faithful as the sunrise. I'd like to be as faithful as the phases of the moon. I'd like to be as faithful as the seasons of the year. That you can look at me, and if it's Sunday, it's time to go to church. I'm going. If it's time for this, that, or the other, if you've asked me to do it, I'm there. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to commit myself to doing it because I'm going to say yes. Not yes and no. I'm going to say yes. That's faithfulness to God. And he's never going to ask you for things he's not going to provide you the means to accomplish it. You need to understand that. Don't say, well, I can't. You can. God would not ask you to do something. He's not going to provide what you need to do it. Everything, service, giving, being a part of something habitually and continually, engaging in spiritual disciplines, he's going to give you what you need. You just need to commit yourself to be faithful.